As you know, we've been working through the Gospel of John now for several weeks. And John is the only chronological gospel, and so it gives us time indicators. And as we come to chapter 6, actually a whole other year has elapsed in the life and times of Jesus' ministry, so that when we come to chapter 6, we're now 2.5 years into Jesus' ministry, and we're really at the height of his popularity. In fact, at the end of chapter 6, his popularity is really going to take a hit. And it's an intentional thing, and we'll get to that, I believe, next week. But in this 2.5 years, most of his time has been spent up in Galilee. And there's a reason for that. The first trip he took to Jerusalem, he cleansed the temple. He was immediately on the wrong side of the religious leaders. And so there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of opposition to his ministry in Judea, in the area of Jerusalem. But up in Galilee, he is a celebrity. So that everywhere he goes, he draws a crowd. And I think it's important to understand when we look at this, that there's actually several layers to Jesus' ministry and the purpose for which he came. And obviously, the most important one is the fact that he really is the Lamb of God. He has come to save us from our sin. But that's not the only reason he's here. A big part of his life and ministry is devoted to training the 12 because he knows there's this thing, we call it the church age, or we call it the age of grace. He knows that that's coming. And as it comes, he's going to give his disciples this commission: go into all the world and make disciples. And he needs to prepare them for that ministry. And he's using some very normal techniques. He's doing a lot of teaching. If you remember, and I talk about this quite often, in Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, you see this construction often. You have heard it has been said, but I say unto you. Now, what that tells us is a lot of the teaching that was normal, that was customary, that was circulated among the Jewish people at that time was incorrect. That's why Jesus has to say, well, you've heard this, but let me correct it. I say unto you. So he's teaching them the truth. He's teaching them what they need to know and what they need to believe. He's teaching them why this is important. And then, as he's conducting his life, and they are with him in this 24/7 relationship, he's modeling that truth, and he's giving them an example of how they should conduct their lives as followers of Jesus. They're learning how to live. They're learning how to speak. They're learning how to react to the different circumstances that they're going to face in their future ministries. They're learning how to serve. And then most importantly, I believe, because sooner or later, this has to happen in this training process. As they are growing, he, in a very safe way, is giving them opportunity to exercise their gifts. Several times in Scripture, he sends them out to preach. He sends them out to minister in the same way that he has, using their gifts, using their abilities. But he's doing it in a very safe way because he is still here with them. So that when they face difficulty, when they come up against something that they're not quite ready for, he's able to help them. And an awful big part of that training is the idea of tests. Tests are designed to stretch us. God uses them so that we can grow. if you remember, one of those times that Jesus sent them out to preach. They met with a lot of success. They come back, they're all excited. Man, we were casting out demons, we were healing people. But then they say, but there was this one case where this man was demon possessed and we couldn't cast that demon out. Jesus, why? Jesus said, well, that kind only comes out through prayer and fasting. So they were learning to serve and exercise their gifts. But Jesus is right there with them, and God is using that kind of a test. Hey, we came across this. We weren't able to fix this. Why? And that test was a part of their growth and a very important part. And just like the 12, I would suggest in our own spiritual journey, we're going to experience tests. We talk about it all the time. We live in a broken world. I don't know how you live in a broken world and not experience tests on a somewhat regular basis. And the question we're going to try to answer this morning is, when the tests come in our lives, will we pass? And to answer that question, we're going to look at a couple tests here in John chapter 6 that the disciples faced. And as we evaluate them, I think it's going to really help us. We're going to learn some valuable lessons so that when tests come our way, we're going to be able to handle them just a wee bit better. So we start in John chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. Sometime after this, and the whole year has gone by, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover was near. That's how we know a year has passed. When Jesus looked up and sees this great crowd coming towards him, he says to Philip, hey, Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have even a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Hey, I found a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? We have here the feeding of the 5,000. It's a very familiar story. But I think whenever we come to Scripture, especially a historical narrative like this, I think it's important to understand the setting. And so we have Jesus and his disciples up in Galilee. He's a celebrity there. He's at the very height of his popularity. I don't know that Jesus would appreciate this, but he would kind of be on the same classification. Who's the young lady that's dating Travis Kelce? Taylor Swift. He's right up there as far as Taylor Swift is. You can see how popular she is with me. I know Travis Kelce. I don't know her. Couldn't name one song she sings, but that's irrelevant. But she's really popular. You can't watch the news and not hear her mentioned all the time. Well, Jesus has that kind of celebrity. Everywhere he goes, crowds are following him. And in this particular case, there's at least 5,000 people. It's interesting that Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000, he says that 5,000 men were fed aside from the women and children. So there might have been 8,000 people there, 9,000 people there, 10,000 people there. We know there's at least 5,000 who were fed. They're following Jesus because the reality is they've never seen or heard anything like him. He's doing miracles. His teaching is radically different than anything they've ever been exposed to, and they really don't want to miss a thing. It's like I want to hear what he says next. I want to see what he does next, and because he's always doing the unexpected. He's always doing the amazing, and they don't want to miss a thing. And in this particular context, it has gotten late in the day, and it's dinner time, but the problem is they're in a remote area. And Jesus is looking at them, and it's interesting, he wants to feed them. So he says to Philip, Philip, where can we buy bread to feed these people? And what's interesting, and I assume John figured this out at some point, because the event happened here, and John's writing, 60 years, 55 years later. So somewhere in there he figured it out. And he puts in, Jesus asked that question, but it was a test. He already knew what he was going to do. Now let's look at Matthew's account. We get a little more detail. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. You need to send the crowd away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. And here's the challenge Jesus has for them. Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And their reply is, we have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. The challenge is disciples want to send the people away, and Jesus wants to feed them. He's already asked Philip, and we know this is a test. Hey, Philip, where can we buy bread? And what's interesting is if we were to characterize the disciples, and I don't want to offend anyone, we might categorize Philip as being a little bit of a nerd. Because he's looking at the question, and there is no doubt about it, he is a very, very much a realist. And he's kind of a statistician or a data guy, because he's looking at the crowd of people, and he's kind of doing, some math in his mind, and he's well, Jesus, here's the problem. If we had a half year's wages, so what's the average income in Modesto? 80,000? I want a round number because it's easier to do math. So if we had $40,000 and there was actually a bread store that was available out here in this remote place, and we could buy $40,000 worth of bread, here's the problem, Jesus. That would only be enough for everyone to have one bite. That's why the disciples want to send the people away. They're looking at a problem, and they're recognizing, we don't have an answer for this. This is beyond our ability. We've got 5 small barley loaves. We've got 2 small fish. We've got as many as 10,000 people. We have no answer here. Their conclusion is send them away. And Jesus' challenge to them is, no, I want you to give them something to eat. And the problem is, there are no markets, there's no Costco, there's no Walmart Supercenter, there's no restaurants, there's no caterers, there's no Uber Eats, there's no DoorDash. They have no money, they have very little resource, 5 loaves, 2 fish. And in Jesus' mind, and those moments when you're really befuddled as to why Jesus is doing whatever he's doing in your life at any given moment, that's kind of like, man, I don't know what he's doing. This explains that. The disciples are in an impossible situation, and Jesus decides this is the perfect opportunity for me to teach them the next lesson they need to learn as far as their future is concerned. So he says, hey, I want you to give them something to eat. And then the lesson happens. We continue the narrative at verse 10. Jesus says, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves. He gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves and left over by I'm getting that muddled up here. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. The disciples are looking at an impossible circumstance. Jesus is seeing a teaching moment. And he does that in my life. I'm sure he's done that in your life. He sees the world very differently than we do. And that's why so often we scratch our heads like, Jesus, what are you doing here? Well, he's seeing a teaching moment. So he has the people sit down. He takes the loaves, he takes the fishes, and he prays. And he begins to distribute the food. And as he distributes the food, the miraculous begins to unfold. It very much reminds me when, if you remember, we studied the life of Elijah. And there was a time when God directed him up to the widow who lived in the Gentile territory, Zarephath, kind of northern, along the coast in roughly Syria, I guess we'd call it. And when Elijah first met her, she was gathering some sticks, preparing to cook her last meal. She said, I'm just going to make some food for my son and I. We're going to eat it, and then we're going to die because we have no more food. And there's a drought, and so there's a famine. And so we're not going to get any more food, so we're going to eat this last meal, and then we're going to die. And Elijah says, well, just make me something first. And she does. And then she makes something for her son, and she makes something for herself. And the next day, she looks in her barrel. Oh, there's just enough to make a little bit more. There's a little bit oil, just enough to make a little bit more. They make it through that day. Next day, they look in the barrel, and guess what? There's still a little bit left. We got enough for another day, and then another day, and then another day. That's exactly what's happening. Because how long? You've got 12 disciples. You got 5 fish or 5 loaves and 2 fish. You can't even hand one thing to each of the disciples to distribute. So if the miracle didn't happen, Jesus' distributing the food would have taken about 2 seconds. It's like, okay, we're out of food. But no, he just keeps handing it out and handing it out and handing it out. It's like a miracle that just continues to happen. And he just keeps handing it out, and the people eat until all of their hunger is satisfied. And then, just to make the point even stronger, Jesus says, hey, I want you to gather up all that's left over. And when they gathered up all the leftovers, they had more than what they started with. They had 12 baskets of food, which may be intentional. It doesn't tell us this in Scripture, but there's 12 apostles, and Jesus is trying to teach them a lesson for their future ministries. And I'm just doing the math. every one of them could have had a basket of food that was left over from this miracle to remind them of what they should have learned in this particular moment. And the lesson is something like this: nothing is impossible with God. Now, let's look at a second lesson in the same context. We're still in John 6. We pick up the narrative now at verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and they set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the water began to get rough. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. Very familiar story. John doesn't give us as many details as Matthew does, and so I wanted to put the Matthew account up here as well. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there all alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land. It was being buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat. Peter walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When we look at these accounts, basically what we have here is a continuation of the day's events that had started with the feeding of the 5,000. So that after the meal, after the miracle, he sends the disciples across the lake to Capernaum. And again, the narrative doesn't tell us this, but I kind of think it's intentional. I think it's similar. Jesus knows what he's going to do, so I'm going to send you guys ahead. I know there's going to be a storm. I know I'm going to walk on the water. I know you're going to be scared to death because you're going to think I'm a ghost. But there's an important lesson to be learned here. And so I think it's somewhat intentional. He disperses the crowd. He spends some time alone with God in prayer. And then in the pre-dawn hours, he takes a walk of some 3 to 4 miles on the lake, which is interesting. I've walked by lakes. I've walked around lakes. I've never walked on the lake, especially 3 to 4 miles. But that's exactly what Jesus did. And while he's walking out to them, they're out in the middle of the lake. They're struggling because the storm is kicked up. The wind and the waves are against them. It's dark. And out of nowhere, they see Jesus approaching. Now, they don't know it's Jesus. And so they're afraid. And I've heard a lot of people kind of be a little bit harsh, a little bit judgmental. Oh, they were afraid. They shouldn't have been afraid. I would like them to be in the boat, in the storm, in the middle of the night. Have you ever been out on the water in the middle of the night? I've told you this before. I had a pastor friend. Actually, he was my youth pastor when I was younger. And he had planted a church down in Maryland. And in Maryland, there's this thing called the Chesapeake Bay. And in the Chesapeake Bay, there's some islands. And on those islands, there was some Sitka deer. They look like little elk. And they would run from island to island, and we'd go out there and we would chase them from island to island. And we were supposed to get back at a certain time. And it reminds me of this story because we have to go by boat, and it's just pitch black because we hunted all day, and then we got something to eat, and then, okay, now it's time to go back. And I'm sitting in the boat with my arm like this. I'm on the side. And it's a little bit rough. There is a big, I don't know if it was a barge or a ship, somewhere near to where we had to go, but there's no lights on it, and we don't have any lights. And so we're trying not to hit that thing, and it's kind of rough. I'm sitting here, and we hit a wave, and my elbow went under the water. And I made a suggestion right then and said, I think we should go back to the island and do this in the morning when we can actually see. And that's what we ended up doing, because we would probably all drowned. It was rough, and we were nuts for even trying. So we went back, and all the wives were scared to death and making phone calls, and Bobby Reinert was my pastor friend, and so his wife's getting all these phone calls, and she has no answers. And the next morning, we made it back, and, well, we all survived, and probably got a few gray hairs out of the matter. But my point is, I don't fault the disciples one bit. When my elbow went underwater, it was like, you know what? I make a motion, we go back to the island. I don't like the idea of continuing our journey. I was scared, and I didn't see a ghost or anything that I thought was a ghost. I just got a wet elbow. That was the extent of what happened. But I was scared, so I understand their fear. You really wouldn't expect to see anything like this. This is not normal. People do not walk on water, so they think they're seeing a ghost. And Jesus recognizes their fear, so he calls out to them. Hey, guys, don't be afraid. It's me. Take courage. It's me. I'm not out to get you. Now, if the story ended right there, there would already be a lesson, and it would reinforce the previous lesson. Nothing is impossible with God. But in what happens next, I think the lesson is taken up a notch. Because Peter calls out in the narrative, if you really are Jesus, tell me to come to you on the water. And in the rest of the story, we have a very important lesson about to unfold. And that starts with understanding the rabbi-disciple relationship. In that culture, the best of the best would be selected by a rabbi, and the rabbi's job would be basically, I need to pour myself into you so that you become exactly like me, so that you can do exactly what I do. And when someone was chosen as a disciple, they would aspire to become exactly like their rabbi. So if we put ourselves in Peter's shoes, here's what Peter's thinking, because he understands that relationship. It's very normal for him. In his thinking, it's, well, if Jesus can walk on the water, then I ought to be able to walk on the water. Because he's training me to become exactly like him. And so he says, hey, Jesus, if this is you, tell me to come to you on the water, and that's exactly what I'll do. And the test is the fact that in this case, you're talking about something that's impossible. It's not like, okay, Peter, let me teach you how to teach. Or let me teach you how to have compassion. And if we go back to like how Jesus talked with the woman at the well, or how he made the point, we have to go through Samaria. Okay, Jesus cares about Samaritans, and Jesus is willing to have a dialogue with this immoral woman. It's not a lesson like that. They're not impossible situations. They're culturally out of step, but they're not impossible. Any one of the disciples could go through Samaria. Any one of the disciples could have a discussion with the woman at the well. Not one of the disciples could walk on water. So the test is the fact this is impossible. And that's where the previous lesson is kind of important. Is walking on water any more impossible than feeding 5,000 people with a couple loaves and fishes? I don't think so. And right in front of your eyes, you're seeing Jesus walk on water. And Jesus shouldn't be able to walk on water, but he shouldn't be able to feed 5,000. He shouldn't be able to turn water into wine. He shouldn't be able to raise disabled people or heal the blind or cure lepers or any of the stuff he's doing. He shouldn't be able to do any of that, but yet he's doing all of that. So in Peter's mind, as a follower of Jesus, it's like, hey, Jesus is training me to be like him. And he will give me the gifts that I need to be like him. And so he says, hey, Jesus, if it's really you, command me to come to you. And Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat. And Peter starts walking on the water. In other words, Peter starts doing the impossible. And I think in that moment, it dawned on him where he was and what he was doing. And he lost his faith. The text tells us he got distracted by the storm. He began to focus on the wind. He began to focus on the waves. And in that distraction, he begins to panic. And as he begins to panic, he also begins to sink, and he cries out, Lord, save me, and Jesus catches him. But he doesn't miss the chance to point out to Peter what had happened, because this is a part of the teaching moment. Peter, you have a little faith. Your doubts overcame your faith. Why? You saw me feed the 5,000. You saw me walk on water. You yourself walked on the water. How did you do that? I think this is all part of, the dialogue and the conversation. You did that because you had faith. You had enough faith to get out of the boat. You had enough faith that you were able to walk on the water. And then you started to doubt. Why? I think the implication is, Peter, don't ever doubt me. Peter, you can do the impossible when you have faith. The verse I always share with you. I can do all things through Christ. He will give me the strength. So let's try to wrap this up for today. we have two accounts here. They're really quite different. We have a storm at sea and we have the feeding of the 5,000. They're very different accounts, but they do have a common denominator, and that common denominator is they both are settings of an impossible situation. And that's the test. We have a God with whom nothing is impossible, but in life, we often encounter situations that when we look at them, they seem to be impossible. And when we encounter those kinds of moments, what we need to remember is we have a God who has given us this incredible promise. And I know I tell it to you all the time, and it's very repetitious, but he tells us, you can do all things through Christ. I will give you the strength. And in those moments when we're staring at something that to us it seems impossible, we need to remember that. The same God that allowed Peter to walk on water is our God. Whatever the circumstances we face, I mean, really, do you ever expect to encounter a situation that's the equivalent of Peter walking on water? Because I don't. I mean, I've been in a number of different binds that I thought, oh, good grief, I have no answer for this. But if you said, hey, Vince, we're going to fill up the baptistry. We want to see you walk across the water. I was like, okay, you can fill up the baptistry, but you're not going to see me walk on water because people just can't do that. I mean, that's a physical impossibility. I've been in binds where in my mind it's like, oh, this is hopeless. I have seen God deal with hopeless in my mind many times. It's almost like I stopped saying things are hopeless because I've seen God diffuse so many hopeless situations. I don't expect I'm ever going to encounter something that would be equivalent of walking on water. That's the lesson that God is trying to impress upon us. Really, nothing is impossible with me. If you trust me, you can do all things through Christ. I don't care what life throws at you. You can do all things. I will give you the strength to handle that. Now, here's two really important questions. How do you learn that? How do you learn nothing is impossible with God? Unless he puts you in impossible situations. And he puts you in impossible situations enough so that you get to the place where not only do I know nothing is impossible with God up here, I've learned that lesson. And so it's a part of who I am. It's a part of what I am. And I think the answer to that question is tests. God uses tests to stretch us. God uses tests to grow us. God allows us to experience circumstances that are beyond us to remind us, hey, can I remind you, you need me. We don't need God to tie our shoes. We've been tying our shoes since what? 2 years old, 3 years old? When do you learn to tie your own shoes? Yeah, you learn that when you're young, right? It's like, hey, I can tie my shoes. I can brush my teeth. There's a lot of stuff I can do. But when God puts you in one of those, well, I have no answer for this. Why is he doing that? He's doing that to remind us, you need me, and guess what? I am here for you. I invite you to come to me. Cast your cares on me. I care for you. He's sitting on a throne of grace. He says, come to me at my throne of grace. I hand out grace like as I say, Diane hands out candy. He gives it out liberally. James 1, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. He gives it out liberally, and he doesn't hold our neediness or vulnerability against us. And every time you encounter one of those difficult circumstances, one of those tests, and you trust God, and you depend on him, and you hang in there, and you get through that trial, and you look back and you see what God did, you know what that's called? That's called growth. Every time you pass a test, you take another step in your spiritual journey. And that is incredibly important because until we go to heaven, we're living in a broken world. And in a broken world, we're going to experience tests literally for the rest of our life. And every time we pass a test here, it's a part of our training to pass the test that's here and here and here and here. Just like David encountered a lion and a bear before he ever dealt with Goliath. And in our spiritual journeys, that test here is designed to help us for the tests that God already knows are coming our way down the road. And no matter what's out there, you can count on, one, he will prepare you for it so that when you encounter it, you will be able to prevail, just like he says in 1 Corinthians, no temptation has taken you, but such as is common to man. What is normal. And he limits what we experience so that we can bear it. There is no doubt tests are coming our way. When they do, please remember, nothing is impossible with God. And if I trust him and I meet this trial by being strong in the Lord, he will give me everything I need to prevail. Let's pray. Father, thank you for some interesting lessons this morning. We've all faced challenges in life. I don't know that we've ever faced anything like trying to feed 5,000 to 10,000 people with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. And I don't know that we've ever faced a storm at sea or tried to walk on water. All of those things seem to be somewhat impossible. But when you're involved, nothing is impossible. And I think that's the lesson you have for us here this morning. I do know for the rest of our lives, we will face challenges. I do know because of the negativity of our culture, it is so very easy for us to think instinctively, I can't. And that's just not true according to you. You tell us, I can do all things through Christ. And so, Father, I pray that you would take these stories that we're very familiar with. I pray you take these stories that remind us nothing is impossible with God. And that we would apply them in a way that the next time we encounter a difficult circumstance, the first words out of our mouth will not be, I can't. It will be, I can do this. Christ will give me the strength. Father, may we be strong in the Lord and in the power of your might, so that in this world where storms are common, we prevail, because I know you will use that to shine a spotlight, not on us, but on yourself, because you will be the reason we prevail. May it be so to the glory of God. Amen. Thank you so much.